In the early hours of a quiet Glendale morning, police vehicles lined a residential street that usually knew only dog walkers and school traffic, their lights flashing silently against stucco walls as officers moved in and out of a modest home that until that moment belonged to a firefighter trusted to run toward danger, not hide it. Inside, investigators discovered the body of a woman, a death that had occurred without screams, without neighbors calling, without warning, leaving only stillness and unanswered questions. The homeowner, a Glendale firefighter, was detained for questioning shortly after the discovery, though authorities emphasize that no charges have been filed and the investigation remains active, with both his identity and the victim's name withheld pending notification of family and forensic results. Neighbors described the shock of seeing a familiar face connected to a crime scene, a man whose uniform symbolized rescue now linked to a death behind closed doors. Police have not disclosed the relationship between the firefighter and the woman, nor the cause of death, as autopsy results are still pending, and detectives continue to reconstruct the final hours inside the home. What is known is that a single call brought officers to a routine address that instantly became something else entirely. A sealed house holding its silence while investigators work to uncover what happened, reminding the community that tragedy does not always announce itself and sometimes lives quietly in the most familiar places until it can no longer be hidden. As the investigation moved into its second day, the street remained subdued, neighbors watching from behind curtains as detectives returned with evidence bags and cameras, documenting details the first sweep could not fully answer. Sources close to the investigation confirmed that the firefighter was released from initial detention but remains a person of interest, a legal distinction that offered no comfort to those trying to reconcile the image of a public servant with the gravity of what had been found inside his home. Forensic teams focused on timelines, phone records, and traces left behind in ordinary rooms that now carried extraordinary weight, while the medical examiner worked to determine how the woman died and when. Authorities continued to withhold specifics, stating only that the death was being treated as suspicious until proven otherwise, and urging patience as facts were separated from rumor. Meanwhile, the fire department placed the firefighter on administrative leave, a procedural move that underscored how seriously the situation was being taken, even as colleagues struggled privately with disbelief. The house remained sealed, the questions multiplied, and the case shifted from shock to scrutiny, where every hour, every message, and every silence would matter in determining whether this was a tragic accident, an act of violence, or something far more deliberate. By the end of the week, the investigation had narrowed its focus, not through public announcements, but through quiet shifts in police presence and legal activity that signaled progress behind the scenes. Detectives were seen re-entering the home late at night, retracing steps, measuring distances, and revisiting small details that might have been overlooked when the discovery was still fresh. Friends of the victim began speaking privately to investigators, offering pieces of her last known movements and the relationships that surrounded her, while digital evidence, texts, calls, and location data started to form a timeline that could not lie even when people could. The firefighter's home, once just another address on the block, now functioned as the center of a widening circle of scrutiny, pulling in co-workers, acquaintances, and anyone who had crossed the victim's path in the final days before her death. Authorities remained careful with their words, repeating that no conclusions had been reached. Yet the tone had shifted from uncertainty to intent, as if the case was no longer about what happened, but about proving it. In Glendale, the silence that followed the sirens felt heavier than before, a waiting silence, one that suggested the truth was no longer hidden, only delayed. As pressure quietly mounted, the investigation entered a phase where patience mattered more than speed, and every step was measured against what could be proven in court, rather than what the public wanted to know. Detectives began coordinating with prosecutors, reviewing evidence not for discovery, but for durability, ensuring that when answers came, they would hold. The firefighter, still off duty, remained largely unseen, while attention shifted to inconsistencies in timelines, gaps in explanations, and moments that no longer aligned as cleanly as they first appeared. The woman at the center of the case was slowly emerging from anonymity through fragments of her life shared with investigators, turning her from a victim into a person whose final hours deserved clarity. Neighbors reported fewer patrol cars, but the absence of visible activity only masked the intensity of what was happening behind closed doors, where files thickened and theories narrowed. The case, once defined by shock, had become a quiet test of endurance, one where truth was being assembled piece by piece, and where the final outcome would depend not on speculation or rumor, but on what could be proven when the silence finally broke. Days later, subtle signs suggested the case was approaching a turning point, not through announcements, but through movement. Meetings at the district attorney's office, extended interviews, and a renewed presence of unmarked vehicles near the sealed home. Investigators were now working backward from evidence rather than forward from questions, testing each conclusion against physical proof, digital records, and witness statements that had begun to align. The firefighter's role remained undefined publicly, yet the focus had clearly tightened, with sources confirming that investigators were no longer casting a wide net, but examining specific actions and decisions made in the final hours before the woman's death. What once felt like a mystery had narrowed into a narrative with edges, one that could soon be challenged, confirmed, or dismantled in court. For the community, the waiting had become its own burden, a suspended moment where trust, reputation, and truth all hung in the balance, and where the next official statement, whenever it came, would not just update the case, but redefine how this quiet street and the people connected to it would be remembered. By the second week, the investigation had settled into a deliberate rhythm, with detectives revisiting every piece of evidence multiple times, re-interviewing witnesses, and cross-referencing statements against timelines and digital footprints. Forensic specialists worked quietly, uncovering details invisible to the casual observer, traces of activity, subtle signs of struggle, and patterns that could indicate the final sequence of events. The firefighter remained under scrutiny, his movements monitored, communications reviewed, and alibis tested, though authorities continued to withhold formal charges, citing the ongoing complexity of the case. Public attention had waned slightly, but the intensity behind the scenes had only increased, with investigators piecing together not just what happened, but how responsibility should be determined. In Glendale, the streets returned to their usual quiet rhythm, but the house at the center of the case remained sealed, a silent reminder that tragedy had touched an ordinary neighborhood, and that the search for answers, patient, methodical, and unrelenting, was far from over.